Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In our recent long wave video, we discussed gold as once again assuming its long-held status as a geopolitical hedge against risk. The primary driver of present geopolitical risk is the Ukraine-Russian war. In this session, I want to build on that by exploring what is the strategic thinking of President Vladimir Putin, or at least the best I can surmise it. I strongly believe there's a lot more going on here than most fully appreciate. I also hope to tie our discussions in with one of our 2022 macro and investment themes, the theme here being the investment theme of energy and the macro environment that centers it. Russia is at the center of much of what is currently going on in energy, and therefore it is important to understand the drivers behind President Putin's possible thinking. As such, I hope to cover the items outlined here in this video. President Vladimir Putin was a highly trained, successful career KGB agent. Having operated at the highest levels and rising through the ranks during the Cold War and the subsequent breakup of the former USSR, he is acutely aware of what led to the downfall of the USSR. Based on recent videos, he appears to still hold significant resentment towards the collapse of the USSR. We must recognize that he understands geopolitical strategy and therefore understands that strategy is what happens to you while you're looking the other way. The U.S. won the Cold War because it forced Russia into an unwinnable arms race with the U.S., which bled the USSR of its finite resources. The U.S. established the battleground on the U.S. strength as the industrial giant in the world at that time. Putin is acutely aware of this and therefore is well aware of where the U.S.'s Achilles heel lies. Putin never accepted it, frankly, and that is blatantly clear in the speech. Putin recently released this half-hour video outlining his beliefs on why military action against the Ukraine was merited. I encourage you to listen to it to hear the deep-seated frustration he has with what happened to the former USSR and how it has lost its natural position, as he sees it, as a preeminent global power. Clearly, he plans to resolve this and restore that position. Ukraine is his first step. What he doesn't express is that he is afraid that Russia faces a second collapse, a collapse once again the product of the policies of the West. Putin understands that the central issue behind the 1991 collapse of the USSR is actually in fact the same issue that once again appears to be behind Russia's current fear of collapse, and that is continued inflation-adjusted low oil prices. But when we historically examine inflation-adjusted oil prices, we see that a long period of relative low prices with a short-lived, uneventful spike preceded the 1991 collapse. It hamstrung Russia's resources and limited its ability to compete effectively with the Cold War on the battleground that we, the United States, established. Low energy prices were harmful in many ways and still are. They reduced funds for reinvestment, which led to the collapse in oil supply. They reduced the funds available to pay wages. They also reduced the tax revenue that the Soviet Union could collect. I must acknowledge here the great work that Gail Teverberg of Our Finite World did in putting together some of the charts I'm using here. Another of her illuminating graphics shows that the Soviet Union's energy consumption rose rapidly in the period after World War II. Russia became a military rival of the U.S. as its energy consumption grew. In the 1965 to 1985 period, its energy consumption leveled off before the central government collapsed in 1991. In fact, energy consumption has never gotten back to its levels in the late 1980s. It appears that Russia now fears that it is near collapse, not too different from the collapse, as I said, of the central government of the Soviet Union in 1991. Such a collapse would lead to a huge drop in Russia's living standards, even from today's relatively low level. Putin understands energy, he understands commodities, and he understands their role. To understand Putin's strategy, you also need to understand Putin's perception of their role in the global stage and geopolitical background. Since about 2013, there has also been a long period of low, collapsing prices on an inflation-adjusted basis. Unless this pattern of low prices can be reversed quickly, Russia as a political enemy, as I've said, could collapse. Exports of all the goods it now produces would likely fall. What Russia, as well as every other oil producer, needs is a way to move oil prices significantly higher, for example, to $150 per barrel, so that more oil can be extracted. The price then merits the cost. During President Trump's presidency, oil prices, as you may recall, hit a low of $10 a barrel, and he tried hard to get prices back up to $40 a barrel to protect U.S. producers from collapsing. Putin's hope is that a Russia-China-centric economy might be able to do this. Ideally, the tolerable maximum price for coal and natural gas would rise as well. The scary fact facing Putin is that the global per capita energy consumption is flat to falling. It is also projected, as shown in the small insert here, to fall significantly over the next decade. He must do something to get prices up and to shift the chessboard, that is the geopolitical strategy, or what has been called the Great Game. The Great Game historically has been centered on energy. Who has it, who needs it, and who can use it to their competitive advantage. Putin sees that a strengthening global economy, or a new world order if you would, in the future could be centered on Russia and China, with them being tightly bound with other aligned, what is referred to as BRIC member nations. The commonality, besides strong anti-capitalist, anti-American sentiment, is their dominance as commodity producers. For those not familiar with the terminology, the original BRIC nations were and stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. All are recognized as strong commodity players in their respective regions. In the latest annual conference, that membership has now grown to 15 member states. This does not include the closely aligned Asian Shanghai Cooperative Agreement members. By adding the commodity-rich African nations through Chinese agreements, along with the commodity-rich Central Eurasian stands, as you might call them, as an entity, they have control of commodities that an industrial Western power is completely dependent on. You can produce nothing if you do not have the basic materials. Few appreciate that the advancement of global supply chains have handed this advantage to the non-industrialized supplier nations. It's called checkmate. Of course, it must be played properly and strategically. Time will tell if this happens. Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping now see the rest of the world economy, to the extent that it continues to exist in their mind, will largely have to get along without much needed fossil fuels, other than the fossil fuels that countries continue to produce for themselves. There is more going on with the massive push of green technology in the fight against climate change than actually just climate change. It's also why the BRICS have been reticent to fully endorse the program, as demonstrated at the recent COP26 conference in Glasgow, Scotland. As a consequence of this potential shift in world order, population and living standards will fall in most of the outside, what they term the outside world. Let's explore why Putin and Xi Jinping may just be right here. I am firmly of the belief that wealth can only be created by growing it, mining it, or building it. It can't be created by printing it. Growing it is about the agricultural complex and seen primarily in the area of soft commodities, grain, soy, pork bellies, etc. Mining is about the process of mining and extracting and seen primarily in the area of hard commodities, nickel, copper, zinc, silver, etc. Building is about production. Production is the process of adding value through combining or modifying materials. This is how wealth is created. It is why commodities are sound collateral, whereas paper collateral must be protected continuously through margin levels and interest rates. To make all this work, energy is required in all three. The process of creation and transformation requires energy. It is the bedrock of an industrialized nation. An industrialized nation's competitiveness depends on their energy costs. The key about energy is that it has a critical balance. It must be both high enough to merit the investment, yet low enough to be affordable at the consumer level or point of sale. Low prices stop investment. High prices stop usage. It is the ultimate supply and demand example in a freely trading market. However, energy, as we've experienced by cartels such as OPEC, is anything but freely traded. Energy operates within a highly charged geopolitical environment. This is because of its profound impact on a nation. Energy directly controls the standard of living of a nation. Decreasing energy consumption per unit of energy means a decreasing standard of living. An example, what the price at the pump today means to the average American family's standard of living. Energy in the form of fossil fuel derivatives directly impacts inflation. It is central to the broadest array of usages imaginable. Energy is a major input to all measures of inflation, 72 major categories to be exact. Most inflation measures are expressed with or without energy because of its volatility and importance, as the other commodity, food, is also. Energy is also about affordability because rising energy costs strangles consumption or consumer spending. In a 70% consumption economy like the U.S., this is equivalent to a consumer shock if prices move significantly. It's the Achilles heel of America. An example of this is what the price at the pump today means to the average American family's budget, what rising heating and electrical costs means to them. So how exactly important is it? How central is it? It is something that can be easily dismissed if you have it. Without it, or having a shortage of it, is quite another thing. We forget, for example, that even the process of creating wealth through growing it, mining it, or producing it requires high levels of energy itself. Commodities and materials require extensive energy usage. Heavy energy usage equipment is required. In miners for heavy extraction, for farmers for heavy use of machine equipment, and for farmers in terms of fertilizers. Putin and Xi Jinping understand that who controls commodities and energy actually controls real wealth. Real wealth is not the product of Wall Street and financialization. That is only a game of accounting. That is basically the Achilles heel of America right now. When the U.S. allowed over 55,000 factories to leave America in the great outsourcing and offshoring movement of the 90s and first decade of this century, when China was accepted into the World Trade Organization, it seriously exposed the U.S. and Western economies. When it adopted global supply chains, it handed future power to those in real control of commodities and energy. We are hitting energy shortages in the near term because of historically chronically low prices. This is abruptly changing. Too low a price slashes energy availability. Supply and demand economics then kick in. However, that has not been happening. Why? So what has been keeping prices down? Energy prices have been kept low for a number of years because of the advent of fracking technology. This technology actually contributed to making America energy independent. Additionally, a decade of quantitative easing inflated standards of living through the wealth effect and Bernanke's enrich thy neighbor to hide fiat currency devaluations via monetization. This hurt Russia, energy, and commodity producers. So how do you get prices up? 3 examples being used by many developed nations is green energy investment and anti-fuel regulations, shortages by shutting down coal and nuclear-powered electrical energy sources, or by making a country energy dependent, as we have witnessed in the EU and recently in the United States. We live in what historians may someday call the fossil fuel age. With high energy consumption goes a high standard of living. A reduction of per capita energy consumption has always in the past led to a decline in civilization and a reversion to a more primitive way of life. The world economy should have known about the importance of fossil fuels and the likelihood that the world economy would face depletion issues in the first half of the 21st century, ever since a speech by Rear Admiral Hyman Rickover in 1957. In this speech, he said, and I quote, "Current estimates of fossil fuel reserves vary to an astounding degree. In part, this is because the results differ greatly if cost of extraction is disregarded or if in calculating how long reserves will last, population growth is not taken into consideration, or, equally important, not enough weight is given to increase fuel consumption required to process inferior or substitute metals. We are rapidly approaching the time when exhaustion of better grade metals will force us to turn to poorer grade, requiring in most cases greater expenditure of energy per unit of metal." He also said, and I quote, "It is an unpleasant fact that according to our best estimates, total fossil fuel reserve recoverables at not over twice today's unit cost are likely to run out at some time between the years 2000 and 2050, if present standards of living and population growth rates are taken into account. I suggest, at least he did, that this is a good time to think soberly about our responsibilities to our descendants, those who will ring out the fossil fuel age. Our greatest responsibility as parents and as citizens is to give America's youngsters the best possible education, including the energy problem of a world with finite resources. Of course, the Western industrial world ignored this in its hubris, but Putin and Xi Jinping have not. If energy prices do not rise high enough, we will somehow need to get along with very little or no fossil fuels. It is doubtful that renewables will last very long, either because they depend upon fossil fuels for their maintenance and repair. We are living in a world today with shrinking energy resources per capita. We should be aware that we are reaching the limits of fossil fuels and other minerals that we can extract unless we can somehow figure out the way to get the economy to tolerate higher prices. If higher energy prices cannot be achieved, there's a significant chance that the change in the world order will be in the direction of pushing the world economy towards collapse. The danger we are approaching is that the possibility that top levels of government everywhere in the world will either collapse or be overthrown by their unhappy citizens. The reduced amounts of energy available will push governments in this way. At the same time, programs such as government-funded pensions, plans, and unemployment plans will disappear. Electricity is likely to become intermittent and then fail completely. International trade will possibly shrink back, and economies will become much more local. We are warned that we would be reaching a time period with serious energy problems about now. The first time came in Rickover's 1957 speech. The second warning came from the 1972 book The Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows and others, which documented a computer modeling approach to the problem of limits of a finite world. The Ukraine invasion may be a push in the direction of more serious energy problems, emerging primarily from the fact that other countries will want to punish Russia. Few people will realize that punishing Russia is a dangerous path. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying there are consequences. A serious concern is that today's economy cannot continue in its current form without Putin or Russia's fossil fuel exports. Putin is playing this card now, while he still has time. Forces are aligned against the West, at least right now. Russia, China, and the BRICS were and are prepared. Their currency reserves have been shifted. Sanction protections have been put in place via alternatives to the SWIFT systems called KIPS or CPFS system, which I outlined in detail in a recent newsletter. They bought physical gold versus accumulating more paper IOU dollars throughout all of the BRIC nations, or the groups that are now bonded together. They stopped or significantly reduced their buying of U.S. treasuries. I laid all of this out in a recent thesis paper called De-Dollarization. They're playing a strategic, longer-term game while the West reacts to events. It is chess versus checkers. It's planning versus reacting. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems, until such time as no one will actually take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what necessarily has been the traditional, true, and tried approach. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2022 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.